So, good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. So, the conception of self, which is an acceptable translation for your much shorter and beautiful word "se," is a very complicated story, and it's a very complicated story because it's a sort of moving target. So what I have to say first is that the conception of self and of subjectivity that I have today is very different from what I had 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And that's very important that you know that. It doesn't mean that it is completely different. There's a genealogy, but it is different. Probably the most important difference is that if I go back 20 years, I think I was being overcautious with what I was saying, and I was being especially overcautious with the notion of a mind that comes out of brain structure. Probably the thing that is most important for me right now is the very sharp separation between things that have to do with mind in general and things that have to do with mind as it pertains to self and to subjectivity. And the very big split that I see here, and that in retrospect was there in my thinking, but now is very, very clear, is, let me enumerate. There are several steps to it, so why don't you continue? So probably the first thing that I would like to bring to this conversation is the fact that in our conceptions of self and of mind, and of course their relation to the brain, we have been wrong in the order in which we have approached the problem. So, for example, it's quite common and perfectly acceptable and normal to think about mind and even of self, beginning to think about the sort of perceptions that dominate our life, which, for people in this room, are visual and auditory perceptions. And visual and auditory perceptions very rapidly translated into language. Right. So this is perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable. We are languaged creatures, and in our case, with the exceptions, of course, of people who are either deaf or blind, in our case, what dominates our intellectual life, what dominates our minds in the general sense, are in fact visual and auditory perceptions and all the images that go with them, and an automatic translation into whatever language or languages we operate. So as a result of this dominance, as a result of this, what I would say is the wrong point of view, the wrong perspective, we have been persuaded over historical time in dealing with problems of the mind, and can easily go back to the Athenian Greeks. We have been persuaded to look at problems of consciousness, of self, and of mind precisely from the point of view of the dominant perceptions or of language or both. Right. And so this has been a problem. It's a problem of, in my view, the wrong perspective, and it's a problem that probably contributed very largely to the kind of wrong intuitions that we have encountered in classical philosophy of mind, which include, for example, the intuition that minds as we know them are not things that are likely to emerge from brain structure and brain function. They're just of a different kind of a different substance, quote unquote, which appears very clearly in more modern philosophy, for example, in Descartes, but not only. It comes all the way to even a segment of current philosophy of mind. Right. And of course it is an intuition that, although wrong, it's understandable. I'm not saying that it is not reasonable to have that intuition, but being reasonable doesn't make it right. So that's one point that we need to make. Right. So what is my current perspective? My current perspective is that, in fact, what we call mind and what ends up being a mind with a self and with subjectivity is something that begins not in connection with the outside world, but in connection with our inner world, in connection with the interior, in connection very much with what we call in general the body. Right. So it doesn't mean, of course, that the outside world, as represented in our brain, does not have a connection with the inside world that we also represent in our brain. Of course they do. But the fact is that the beginning, and I think the issue of origins and of priorities is critical to understand these problems. The issue is that where I think it begins is in the interior, not in the outside world. The next point in this long story, and I'm going to, I promise you I'll finish soon so that we can talk a little bit more, because this is complicated. The next point is that we also have the wrong intuition that somehow, quote unquote, images of our interior, images of the body, would be equivalent to the images we make of the outside world. The images that you're making of my voice, the images that you're making of me, and of her translating me. And I think that is an entirely wrong and unjustified intuition, and that these two things are of a very different kind, even if they are both in our brains. So, final point, and then I stop. What are those differences that I am being very provocative about? Let me see if I can put a few of them together for you. The first is that the images that have to do with our body state would be even better, are images that are tied completely with the state and the function of our body, and even more closely with life, with how life is being run within a living organism. Because of this, those images are of necessity dominated by either pain or pleasure or somewhere in between. It can be just well-being, it can be malaise, it can be proper pain, but they are of necessity related to a valence. I'm not talking about emotion, I'm talking about feeling, I'm talking about what would be sentimento. It's exactly that. And there are no images of our interior that will be devoid of that quality of either pleasure or pain or somewhere in between. I can imagine, and this is something that would relate to the activity of many of you, a condition, a situation in which such images of the body might be devoid of an overt, pleasurable or painful essence, and those would be of people that are depressed and are in a variety of states where their feeling is in fact not normal. Those would be the exceptions. Final point. Coming back to those images, the seeing and the hearing and the touching or the smelling of the world, those images, in my judgment, are devoid all the time of anything that has to do with feeling, anything that has to do with pain or pleasure. They have nothing whatsoever to do with pain and pleasure as they arise in our brains, although because of their nature they can cause pain or pleasure. But of course, by the time you listen to a piece of music with all of its complexity, and you definitely feel pleasure or horror or dislike, you do generate feelings that are attached to that perception. So then you have the two together. The important point in this conception is that that feeling, that particular valence is not being generated directly. It's not in the nature of the image of sound, or looking at Lake Garda and being delighted with the beauty of the scenery. You don't generate that out of the visual image of Lake Garda in of itself. There is no qualia in that image at all. What I think there is in fact a provocation of such a state that is generated out of the visual image and then uses the machinery of the inside processing to create that state. And so, to conclude, when you have my current conception of the self requires a base in this very distinct machinery that has to do with the regulation of life and the automatic production of feelings as a result of life regulation, and that is the platform which is going to be used to generate, through a variety of other mechanisms that I'm not going to put in this answer, is going to generate what we call subjectivity. Well, there are a number of, first of all, the concept of consciousness is extremely varied, and it ranges all the way from a pure mind concept to very complex minds with autobiography, obviously minds with subjectivity, that being the critical distinctive point perhaps, and numerous other accessions. So the way, if I understand correctly, you like Giulio Tononi's idea that an integration of information is critical, and I don't know who would disagree with that. You obviously need to have an integration of information. But I don't quite know what that buys me in terms of explaining how the brain does it, which is what I want to know. Of course, you can define it in any way you wish. Taking one part, it's like taking an object and looking at it in one way or in another, or from above or from below. It's fine, and I don't disagree one moment, but what I'm interested in as my problem is, how does the brain do it? And how does the brain do it in one of the many situations in which we are conscious, which are, of course, very different. Not all of them are alike. That's a big question.
Una grossa domanda.
Yeah, we may... Just before the break. Yeah, we may stay here the rest of the afternoon. First of all, when I talk about feeling, when I talk about sentimento, I'm not talking about emotions. I'm talking about sentimento. I'm talking about the experience we have of a body state, period. Okay? So, there are, in fact, certain feelings, certain sentimento, that we have in relation to a state of the body where we have an emotion. But in fact, the majority of feelings we have in a day are not feelings of emotion. They're feelings of many other things. Feelings of thirst, of hunger, of comfort or discomfort, of being hot or being cold, of feeling well or not feeling well, which have nothing to do with emotions. They are states of the body. And of course, when you have an emotion, your body adopts a certain state, and when you experience that state of the body, which is the state of emotion, then of course it's a feeling of emotion. And that's why I insist on the distinction between emotion and feeling, which is one of the most difficult things to get people to do, because most of the time people confuse the two. And I understand the confusion, but we don't want to have it. We want to make this clear. Right. And finally, in relation, you asked about perception, feelings, and emotions. When you talk about perception, the essence of it is an experience of some kind of map that you make of some set of information that is being relayed to the brain. And it can be the map you make. For example, right now I'm looking at you and looking at everyone around, and I am mapping information that comes through the visual system, comes into my retina, and I'm mapping it out and repeating multiple maps within the brain. And I'm also doing it in relation to sound through my auditory system, and I can do it in relation to the state of my body through the interoceptive system. So it's a beautiful question. The question is not how long or short the questions are, it's how long or short the themes are. The themes are all very complicated. But it's very nice. I think the issue of rhythms is critical, but it is part of what you get when you perceive. And perceive is almost there are reasons. Tomorrow I'll say why I don't like to talk about perceptions of the body, because I think it's more complicated than just a perception. But leaving that aside, when you perceive the state of your body, one of the things you perceive is the natural rhythms that we have, for example, in breathing and in the heart rhythm, and in a variety of other rhythms that are present, for example, in relation to our hormonal states and are controlled by the hypothalamus. Sorry. And of course, the relation to music is one that I'm very interested in, because, music is, although many people tend to talk about music as just another art, is definitely not just another art. It's a very different art, and probably the one that has, other than dance, the closest relation to our body in a very, very specific circumstance, and probably was one of the very first arts, if not the first. And quite strongly, rhythm is one of the fundamental aspects of music. You can, in order to have music, you cannot fail to have rhythm, and you cannot fail to have tonality or lack thereof. So the production of tones and the production of rhythm are essential components of music, and they are very, very, very importantly. So I entirely agree with you that this is important, and that there are many other aspects of our rhythms that play a role in our states. And something that is very intriguing is that it's not only that when, for example, when you're happy, you have a certain kind of rhythm to your life. It's also that you can have happiness coming out of a certain kind of rhythm. So the two things are so involved in each other that one can provoke the other and vice versa. So the distinction between perception and representation, it really depends on the context. You can make that distinction, and your use of, for example, information represented, say, in an iPhone, would help to make that distinction. But it really depends on your context. I don't have any problem talking about representations as a fundamental element of my perceptions. So in some senses, it's one and the same thing because you cannot have one without the other. But I can perfectly well realize that there are representations that may or may not be perceived. So there's a distinction that depends on the context. Right. The point of your question that I think is very important is that as a result of certain developments in human history, we were able to create external representations that are sort of like the states of our brain, but that are externalized. And they appear, for example, in the form of drawings, paintings in general. They also appear in a very different level of representation in music, and they appear, once, say, 5,500 years ago, they start appearing in the form of writing, once writing develops. And those representations have been externalized, and the ones that are now occupying a lot of our attention are the ones that come to us thanks to Silicon Valley, and that in fact dominate a lot of our cultural life. And they are there, the distinction between perception and representation that you're making becomes much more valid because it is something that is external to us and that may or may not be perceived. Unfortunately, it's very much perceived by everybody because everybody is hanging on their cell phones and iPads. Well, to do justice to your image, I would have to think more about it, but I can deal with some aspects of it. One is the idea of invariability, and I think that we're both invariable to a certain degree, but very variable. So, am I the same self that I was when I was 17? Yes and no. I think I am in certain aspects. I can sort of, in retrospect, recognize a continuity in my life, but I am actually an entirely different person from what I was at 17. And I think the continuity is a bit of an illusion that we create, and it's very convenient so that we don't think we're mati. But I don't think that continuity exists in one sense, is that it all ties to a generally similarly working body. So we have enough of similarity in our body, in the interior, that it maintains that continuity. Sorry, I'll give you time. Just to say one more thing, is that you see, one of the reasons why you have to conceive of the self as coming from a particular kind of interior is that you cannot relate it, for example, to your limbs. You cannot relate it to your legs. You have to relate it to the visceral function, because that's the only thing that tends to be more or less the same. Because otherwise, your limbs grow or shrink or whatever. It's too external already. You have to put something that is really deep and visceral to create the continuity. But your image is very nice. Well, something very interesting because of your question, of course I love poetry, and poetry is very important in accounting for our lives. And it's very important to suggest certain directions, but it is not science. The science is different from the poetry. But Pessoa is interesting because Pessoa was a good analyst of minds. And when you just reminded me of that, I was thinking of Matteo's first question about Tononi and integration of information. It's about integration of information. So there's a connection there. So it's about organizing information of certain kinds, but without having an overt conductor, because we don't have an overt conductor until the moment in which we are mature enough that we can, in certain circumstances, direct our thinking and, in a way, our consciousness. But by and large, consciousness emerges without a conductor. It sort of organizes semi-automatically, and organizes semi-automatically because the purpose of the whole exercise is maintaining life in a survivable way. And if we forget for a single second that this is all about life, and that the brain and the mind and poetry and philosophy is just an afterthought, we're cooked. We cannot understand how our minds work if we don't keep in mind that it's all about life and about the body, and that the rest is music or poetry or philosophy, but it's not what counts. Because, you know, in English, feeling is not at all sensation. It's very specific, and like the German Gefühl, it's very much pertaining to the body, and it's exactly the way I like to see it translated. But in Portuguese, there's no problem. But I've always heard, I had a fantastic Italian translator. I think he's fantastic because he's very attentive and he does a great job, and he asks many questions. That's a sign of a good translator. And he always says that there's a problem with
traduttori dei miei.
Let me see if I understand your question quite correctly. You refer to, of course, the failure of guidance of behavior on the basis of emotions that I described many, many years ago in articles, and was described also in Errori di Cartesio, which is related to the way in which you have to apply a certain emotive state in order to like or dislike, to approve or disapprove of what you're going to say. This is one part of your question. That's the background. So there's no question that you don't need to have brain damage in order to behave incorrectly or badly. You can behave incorrectly or badly because you're badly educated, because the circumstances force you to behave badly, or because you have a pathology that makes you behave badly. So, you know, there's plenty of psychopathic behavior that may or may not have a very structural basis in the brain, and there's plenty of psychopathic behavior that is occurring just because of the culture and of the education that lead you in that direction without there being dysfunction. Of course, we do not know enough yet about why certain behaviors occur that could be classified as psychopathic and could be related, and in many cases are, to, for example, certain neurochemical changes or certain structural changes, not at the level of big regions of the brain, but rather smaller circuits. And then finally, there's something that we need to understand, is that a culture can, through cultural means alone, as far as I can see, change the relation between emotions and, for example, moral reasoning in such a way that it can lead to extremely incorrect behaviors that can be pathologic even at the level of an entire culture. And there are plenty of examples of situations in which people who would otherwise be considered normal and good and decent can behave very badly, especially in a group, and can produce behaviors that are shameful and destructive to themselves and to others. So, but the important thing is that emotion still plays a role there, a very important one. It's not just the intellectual aspect of it, it's the intellectual and behavioral component guided by a very strong emotive side or lack of that strong emotive side. So emotions in that sense are, they operate as a guide, and they operate as the means into a certain result. It's very difficult to conceive of any kind of behavior that occurs in society, whether it has to do, for example, with economic behavior, what people buy or do not buy, how they save, how they operate in that regard, or in the domain of morality and justice, without having the impact of emotions guiding the process in a certain direction, or not guiding it at all and letting it run in a way that is pretty old in terms of life operations. You're questioning the use of my example of depression, for example, as a pathology as opposed to a variant of behavior, simply stated. I don't have a great problem with that. You know, I'm not technically a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist, so this is above my pay grade. But that's an American joke. The idea that I don't have any problem whatsoever with you considering something not pathological per se as opposed to a variant of behavior. That's perfectly fine. It's just that the way I normally think about depression, for example, is something that is not desirable and that indicates a malfunction of the system. And at least it's not conducive to the best optimal form of life. Yeah, I think that, of course, this would take us very far afield because you would have to individualize the cases. I have a lot of sympathy for your point of view in the sense that I think that if we would correct every depression that people ever had in the world, we probably wouldn't have almost any poetry. We would not have a lot of the work of the greatest novelists, because by and large, when you look at their biographies, depression, and certainly a state of confrontation with deep pain, was a great motivation for what they did, and they gave us great work of art. So I have a sympathy for that. But at the same time, even without my being a psychiatrist, I think that from an external point of view, I find it a little bit dangerous because it then may lead to the idea that somebody that is, in fact, in danger to herself or himself could be left untouched just because that could be a good thing. And unfortunately, not everybody can be a poet or a great novelist, and in fact, most of us are not. And therefore, that could be a problem. But that's I think, a minor. I take your point of view, which I think is an important one. I mean, the origin of it. I mean, the fundamental phenomenon is one that comes from the inner state. But of course, that inner state is very rapidly in development, connected to the outside world. And so that there's no denying of the relationship with the outside world. But the core of it, where you have what I would call the platform for subjectivity, is an internal state, but an internal state. The platform, that's where you begin, that's where you jump from. Right. So, because, you see, primates and humans, most of all, are, in terms of their behavior, the most social and the most cooperative of creatures on Earth. So none of this is to be conceived as individual alone. We very rapidly become social. It's very different. I mean, even a baby has to be social, at least with a mother. But so that relationship is going to happen very rapidly. But physiologically, in terms of the brain, the core of it is not on what happens in terms of external perception, but what happens in terms of the inner representation of a body state. That's the platform. But it doesn't deny at all the relationships in society. On the contrary, you need to have those relationships in order to further define what that self is. Whenever we talk about the self, I've always talked about it in different levels of complexity. So there is I've used terms such as a primordial self and a core self and an autobiographical self. And of course, to go back to your question, you cannot have an autobiographical self without having deep relationships with others, and for that matter, even the core self. It's the primordial self that starts and sort of bubbles up from the interior state. And it's there, so the primordial self is surrounded functionally by the core self. It's one way of telling it, and then by the autobiographical self, which is very different because it includes all of the history of memories of your relationships, of your different aspects of your identity, and of what has happened to you in an entire life. So these are very different sets of complexities, but they all relate to a core. And so once again, we're at the problem of origins as opposed to the problem of the end result. So just a little aside to tell you, I don't think I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, but it's interesting. In our institute, one of the most interesting sets of experiments right now has to do with the cellular level of making feelings. So we're not talking about systems in the brain, like, say, the insular cortex or brainstem nuclei. We're talking about what goes on inside neurons, and specifically what goes on inside axons of a certain kind that can be related to feeling states, which is a very specific aspect. Just to make the point that even the primordial self, as I've talked about it, is not the bottom of the story. The bottom of the story is going to be what is happening in single cells when those cells are in fact, and I'm going to use a word that you're going to have to translate directly in Italian, which is when they are irritated. You see, because there is a basic phenomenon in our cells, which is irritability, is almost like scratching a neuron, and the neuron responds, and responds with an action potential. That level is the core. I'm not sure it's the bottom of it, but it is the next level down. You cannot, it would not make any sense to have the cells of the brains alone. They are always immersed in something. I think the irritabilità of the neuron is not exactly a social irritability, but actually, why not? You can push the metaphor down. So I think that the big difference in structural and functional terms is that there's something very beautiful that people normally don't think about. And I've written a little bit about that, and right now it's the thing that most interests me and that I'm writing about. I haven't actually written a full paper about this, but I plan to, and it's certainly going to be in a book. And that is that when you connect to the inside, that inside is both representing itself in the brain, but being automatically affected by the brain. And this is something that only happens in relation to the interior. For example, I'm looking at you. My retina is forming images that are repeated in visual cortices of your face, for example, with other people in the background. But my brain does not do anything to you as an object. My brain is not sending X-rays into you and doing anything whatsoever. You're there, I'm here, and I'm making that perception of you. When I look, quote unquote, at what is going on in my gut or in my heart, that image that comes into my brain is automatically affected by the brain, not only the image, but the state of the gut or the heart itself. The two form a compact, and there's no compact between me and you, but there's a compact between the brain that represents internal states and the very organs that give the origin to that. It's a very, very sharp distinction. So I think that answers your question. This point is very important. It's interesting because I didn't. I sort of knew that it was like this, but it took me a while to realize the importance of this. I think this is absolutely critical in terms of who we are, what we feel, and the different nature of these different processes. I think it's a beautiful question, and I think that I would endorse your interpretation. I think that all of the the feeling systems and internal processes are totally tied with life regulation, the technical term for which is homeostasis. And how we need to cope with what comes our way, either internally or from the outside, because it can come internally, it can come from you reminiscing about something that happened to you, but it can come from the outside, and you need to cope with it in such a way that we don't disturb the homeostasis in any terribly dangerous way. So I think that's an interpretation of a dissociative process that I would be very comfortable with. So the first question, why is it that so many of our colleagues have difficulty in connecting brains with bodies? I don't really know. I think, to me, it always sounded bizarre that one could live in a body and, as a neuroscientist or neurologist or psychologist, start out in a world, or philosopher, start out in a world that is completely devoid of this thing called the body. And I think that probably the reasons are old, historical, philosophical, is that there was, in fact, especially with the rationalist, the rationalist weight on philosophy, there was a rarefaction of anything that was not mind. And there was this huge distortion that I alluded to at the beginning, which is that you start with language and you start with perception of the outside world, which is completely idiotic, because that's not the way we function, and that's not the way we grew up. And I think that this, of course, we have been in a changing world. There are good philosophical precedents for this, but clearly now this imposes itself as a reality. This reality that is, just like you were saying, it's not, you cannot build the house from the roof down. You have to start with the basement, or the house crumbles and never grows. is something that we need to face, and that is that we are not distinguishable from animals by the fact that we have either minds or consciousness, because they too have mind and consciousness. And this is, of course, difficult to accept for many people, but it is the reality. What is very important to note is that the fact that animals, coming in fact all the way down, have something like mind and consciousness does not mean that they have the same mind and the same consciousness that we have. So, for example, the fact that we have the possibility of feeling in relation to a long past history absolutely changes the game and makes our feeling, in fact, more profound. Human suffering is not the same thing as the suffering of an animal in the jungle. It is at the beginning, but then we amplify it because we can have memory. It is one thing to remember pain and think about it and brood about it. It's another thing to have pain and be conscious of it, which animals do. So I'm going to end with two jokes. And one joke is on me. It has to do with, how long I have been in this world. Because it's the distinction between the quality. It's not that animals have mind like we do and have consciousness like we do, but the quality is not quite the same. So my joke is that when I was growing up, when I was an adolescent, the thing that I most wanted to have was an Alfa Romeo. And in fact, at a certain point, very early in my life, I got an Alfa Romeo, which was the car that I still love the most. Too bad that I left it in Portugal. It was there, it was beautiful. It's an enormous quality. There was also a point in my life where I had a Fiat, and it was a different thing. And yet both were cars, both could do the things that a car is supposed to do, except that the Alfa Romeo was of a greater quality than the Fiat. This probably doesn't apply anymore because maybe you don't even have Alfa Romeo anymore. But the other thing that I wanted to say, and it's a bit of a joke, although it isn't, I was speaking some months ago in Silicon Valley, of all places, and somebody, after hearing me speak, it was actually an interview, so it was not that different from this. And somebody got up and said, well, you bringing mind and consciousness all the way down, where do you stop? And I said, at stones.